Right, let's talk about a big upset in New York. Zohran Mamdani has won the Democratic primary for the mayoral race. He's a sort of leftist in the AOC type vein.
The worst kind of leftist vein.
The worst kind of left-winger, the worst kind of self-described socialist. He wants rent control, government-run grocery shops. I think it's very odd, not very exciting. But it seems to have galvanized the sort of, I guess, the American equivalent of the Corbynistas. If you look at who's voting for him, it's like he's dead well, ironically, with the wealthiest New Yorkers, but also it's mostly this kind of downwardly mobile, perhaps, people with high levels of education, but actually quite poor prospects. Tom, what have you made of it?
Well, it's sort of millennial, quote unquote, socialism lives, isn't it? I mean, it's exactly. That very much that model where the kind of coalition that AOC, when she was elected in New York, put together, which is very similar race insofar as you have a insurgent candidate. Really did come out of nowhere. No one knew who this guy was, a few months ago, not just in the UK, but in New York City. So also pitted against a kind of old figure of the old Democratic establishment, in this case in the form of Andrew Cuomo, disgraced former New York
corrupt.
governor, standing accused of, killing people in care homes during COVID by sending COVID patients in there, also the subject of various sexual harassment allegations. It's absolutely incredible that these were the Democratic establishment, once so powerful, if you think about New York and Tammany Hall and that history of the Democratic machine there, that they allowed these two candidates to be put before the electors. It's an expression of the kind of weakness of the Democratic establishment in many respects. But also what's telling, not unlike when AOC won her primary, is where the support is coming from. Because as you say, Mamdani's sort of coalition, such as it is, there's some quite wealthy people, the kind of luxury beliefs lot. There's also a lot of people who are still doing pretty well for themselves, but would expect to be doing better. The sort of people who haven't quite cracked through at their graphic design firm, not quite making as much money as they would have expected to, given how much was spent on their education. Yeah. And are quite frustrated by that. It's not to say that they haven't got a complaint, but this isn't, the sort of urban proletariat, revolting against the establishment, shall we say.
It's not the French Revolution.
It's not the analysis, although very early on, seems to be that he did very well with places that had above average levels of graduates and above average levels of non-Hispanic whites, which I think is a story that tells itself. Meanwhile, Cuomo did very well in the kind of like working class, outer, almost suburban areas as well. He did particularly well amongst black voters in the Bronx. So you're kind of seeing that way in which the social base for millennial socialism, the kind of new post-Sanders, post-AOC socialism, is a mix of quite wealthy people and also people who are downwardly mobile, but from still quite an elevated position, I think it's fair to say. So it's a repeat of that, and it's fascinating as far as what it says about the Democratic Party and so on, but I think it's also intriguing about how this supposed upsurge in leftism that we saw on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly kind of post-2016, although it had petered out for a while, A, it's not going anywhere, but B, the groups in which it speaks on behalf of are not the ones that they claim to speak on behalf of. That's always the case.
Ella?
Yeah, I think Joel Kotkin wrote in Spike this week, and he called the main section of his supporters the precariat. These people who, for whom, policies like maybe not state-run grocery stores, they probably wouldn't frequent them.
Quite expensive, probably.
Yeah. But things like childcare, or there's a big thing about transport, use a huge amount of their paycheck on getting to work, which is true, and there's nothing wrong with that policy, but it's the kind of concern of a squeezed lower middle class, I suppose we would understand it to be, or and that's important because, one, those people are really politically fickle. They, infamously, they always have been, and lots were, in the bigger picture of America, lots were pro-Trump because of the sort of business grow the economy thing. But also, I was reading this article by Bernie Sanders in The Guardian, celebrating the victory, and the way in which he talked about the fact that, the old Democratic elite don't know anything, and using this very sort of big sort of jazz hands socialist kind of language, and you think, but it's just a different section of the elite. You have the kind of very sort of proper Hillary Clinton style swish networky Democrat elite, and then you have these sort of scrappy but equally kind of posh children of that sort of oligarchy, who, hold the same political views, but just express them in a kind of wokier, more fashionable way. It's also, if you look at some of the things that Mamdani has said, for example, to internationalize the
globalize the intifada,
globalize the intifada, which, people debate it, but in a place like New York, which is full of Jews, who a lot of them view that in a particular way, not as some kind of like, oh, let's, have a discussion about Palestine, but as a sort of violent call to the death of the Jews.
Yeah.
That's something. Is he going to be speaking for those New Yorkers? And among beneath the gloss of this kind of like lovely liberal progressive is some really dark views, but also some kind of classic crap woke views around transgenderism, around all of that. And it's just very uninteresting because it's like AOC 2.0. And it just shows that the Democrats haven't learnt anything, because they're either pumping out the old elite candidates, or they're pumping out these new elite candidates, and nowhere is there anything fresh.
It's like the kind of the crap. It's just the way in which like this new left are indistinguishable from the cultural elite, essentially. And Mamdani is a good example of this. This is a guy who had a kind of an abortive rap career. I mean, like AOC, they're kind of like frustrated theatre kids to a certain extent, which is why they're so good at social media and TikTok, which is obviously a big part of his election here. I believe his mum was a very well decorated filmmaker who won things at various film festivals and so on. I think that's telling, the way in which is this thing we now call the left is basically indistinguishable from people who might be trying to get on in the various cultural industries, are finding because economically it's a bit more expensive in the cities, or because there's not as many opportunities. There's a bit of elite overproduction going on. They're working at the Whitney, but they're probably never going to make curator. That is the base of the left now. Places like New York City, and whatever else you might want to say about some of the legitimate complaints they have, that's a historic shift, isn't it?